of the nice things about fall is that it's nice and cool and you're really anxious to have some soup. So that's what we're going to do today. It's a winter squash and apple soup. And I'm going to use a butternut squash for this. Now in order to get started, I'm going to put a tablespoon of canola oil. You could use other kinds of vegetable oil as well. In a big pot. I'm using a Dutch oven, but if you have some other big pot, that will work equally well. You want to make sure that it has a fairly large surface area though, because you do want some evaporation to come off of this. That's going to help cook it down just a little bit and give it a little bit more thickness. This has got a little bit of sweetness to it, so we don't want to miss any of that too. Now I have one big onion, a large onion. It's going in here with our oil. We've gotten the oil just a little bit hot. Put that in there. We're going to start and we're going to saute the onion in the oil along with a teaspoon of freshly grated ginger. Now I love the smell of these two cooking together, and we're going to put some chicken stock in it in a little bit, and those go so well together. In fact, combining these two ingredients always makes me think of my grandmother, because she always made chicken noodle soup with ginger in it. So I always have that flashback of being with Grandma whenever I make this. Now we are using butternut squash for this particular one, but you have some other options. I'm using butternut squash, which is this one here. It usually comes anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds, 2 to 4 pounds. A 2-pound one will do you well. The reason I like this one is because it's got a little bit of sweetness, and this about from here up is solid meat. So for when you pay whatever you pay, if you don't grow them yourself, you get a lot of squash for your money. It's also not stringy. It's easy to take the seeds out. It's easy to cut when you're working with it. Now we do need to peel this one before we start. We're going to cut it into big chunks. And in order to do that, the first thing you do when you start to work with any of these kinds of squash, you want to make sure that you're doing it safely. So wash it well in cool running water, and then dry it so that it's not slippery, and make sure that the board you're working on is not slippery either. And then cut either the bottom off. With this kind of squash, it's real easy to make a horizontal cut down, but if you're going to work on the side, cut a little bit off the side, some way so that when you set it down, it's not going to roll while you're trying to cut it. And then you can either, you can also use a vegetable peeler to pare it away, or you can proceed with just cutting the skin off it on its own. So any way you do that would work. You could also use pumpkin. However, it's a little bit harder to get the peel off of it. It's easier than some of the others. Acorn squash might also be usable, but that one's got real problems with having the peel real hard to remove when it's not cooked. Once you cook it, it works fairly well. The problem with both the pumpkin and the acorn squash, however, is that they both tend to be a little bit stringy, particularly larger versions of the squash. And so for that reason, you may want to stick with either the butternut or the buttercup. Works also very, very well. I think our vegetables are fairly well along. To that, I'm going to add 6 cups of chicken stock or chicken broth, whichever you have. Now this is one that we haven't added any salt to, or we got the reduced sodium version, or that you make it yourself so you can control the amount of sodium. Now the next thing that's got to get in here at the same time is the squash. Notice I've cut it in pretty big chunks. There's no reason to spend a lot of time making small cubes when the bigger ones will do just what we want them to do. So we're going to add this in, and we're also going to add the apple at this point. And we're going to use a variety of cooking apple, and you can use whatever kind you have that's easiest for you to get or most economical or that you're growing. This particular one is Granny Smith, but you could also use a Jonathan, a Golden Delicious, Fuji, a Gala, or whatever other cooking apple you happen to have. If you're lucky enough to have a Gravenstein, that's one of my favorites, but I don't see many of them in this part of the country. We're going to bring this to a boil, then we're going to turn it down and we're going to simmer it until the squash and the apples are tender, which probably will take 20 to 25 minutes. You want to cover it when it's cooking. All right, we've been cooking this for about 25 minutes, and I've checked the squash with a knife, pierced it with a knife to make sure that it was tender. The apples, even though we leave them in big chunks, the apples always cook a lot faster than the squash do. Now this is, as it is at this point, probably doesn't look as appealing as it could be in a moment, and so we're going to puree this, and so it becomes a nice smooth soup. And I'm going to use a handheld blender, And you may, if you don't have one of these, you can do it in batches in a regular blender or in a food processor. Just make sure that you do it in batches. Also, I want to make sure that I have it turned on fairly low, because it's going to take a little bit. I don't want to splatter everywhere around the garden here. Okay, you can see it gets nice and smooth, and it starts to get that creamy taste to it, or that creamy feel to it. One of the ingredients I forgot to mention earlier on was when we put together the squash and the apples and the chicken broth in here, I also added a little bit of thyme, a half a teaspoon of dried thyme leaves, and that's those little black specks that you see in there. At this point, I'm just going to stir in about a half of a teaspoon of pepper and a half of a teaspoon of salt, and also about a half a cup of half and half. Now you could substitute something thinner for the half and half. If you don't want to actually get the fat content, however, there are some reduced fat varieties of half and half that are available, or you could use an evaporated milk, which would also give you some of that creaminess. But keep in mind that we've added a half a cup. This is 8 servings, so it's about a tablespoon is all anybody's actually going to get. So the half and half is being divided over a lot of soup, and so it's not a big dent on anyone's diet. At this point, it's ready to serve. And as I mentioned, it makes about 8 servings. We're going to put some in one of these bowls. And it is so creamy, it's nice and sweet. And the last thing I want to put with it is a little dollop of sour cream to go on the top as a garnish. And again, about a tablespoon of that to a teaspoon is all you need. And if you're clever, you can take a knife and swirl that through so that you get a nice pattern. I've never been particularly good at that, as you can see. Mine's just going to sink on me. But you can swirl that around and actually let people stir it in if they choose to. It's really, really good. It's a sweet soup, but a nice way to end a fall evening or for having with fall lunch. This is winter squash and apple soup. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.